Hello, my friend. I'm glad you're here, however you found your way to this particular corner of the internet tonight, whether it was a deliberate search or a 3 in the morning stumble or something in between. I'm genuinely glad you landed here. You came here to rest. That's enough. That's the whole reason. So let's do this properly. Before we begin, I want to ask something small of you. If you've been listening to this channel for a while, or if tonight turns out to be exactly what you needed, would you consider subscribing? And maybe a like if it feels right. I know those little things can feel like they don't matter much, but they genuinely do. Not for me, not in any complicated way, but because it helps this little channel find someone else who needs it. Someone else lying awake somewhere, needing a quiet voice, and somewhere to put their mind. That feels worth asking for. So thank you, honestly, if you do. Now, where are you tonight? I find myself genuinely curious about this. Are you in a bedroom somewhere in the north of England, with the particular cold that comes through old windows no matter how many times you've had them looked at? Are you in an apartment in Toronto, the city still faintly humming outside even at this hour, streetlight coming orange through a thin curtain? Or perhaps you're somewhere in the Scottish Highlands, in a house that goes very, very quiet after dark, in a way that city people sometimes find unsettling and you have come to love. Wherever you are, leave it in the comments. I read every single one of them, and I mean that. There's something I find genuinely moving about knowing where people are when they let their guard down enough to fall asleep to history. Tell me, I want to know. Now, before we go anywhere, let's take a moment to settle in. If you can, dim the lights a little, or if they're already off, good, you're ahead of me. Let your jaw go slack. Actually do that. Notice where it's been holding. Let it release. Drop your shoulders. Unclench whatever you're clenching. Your hands, the place between your eyebrows. Take one slow breath and let your legs go heavy into whatever you're lying or sitting on. You don't need to be ready for anything tonight. You don't need to remember anything I'm about to tell you. You can simply receive it and let it wash through and drift. Comfortable? Good. Now, tonight I want to tell you something that the official history of Queen Victoria almost entirely left out. Not the Queen you've seen in portraits. That small, severe, black-clad figure who seems to have been born already ancient, already immovable, already more symbol than human being. Not the grandmother of Europe, not the icon of empire, not the marble monument they eventually built to stand outside Buckingham Palace with her face set in permanent stone disapproval. I want to tell you about the woman inside all of that. The one who laughed until she couldn't breathe. The one who wrote in her private journal with an honesty that startled the people who were eventually allowed to read it. The one who loved, quietly and fiercely, and in ways that made her court deeply, sometimes furiously, uncomfortable. The one who raged and wept and clung and was described by her own prime ministers, in their private letters, in terms they would never have used in public, because the public version had to be protected at almost any cost. Here is something I find genuinely worth starting with. When Victoria died in January of 1901, her daughter Princess Beatrice spent years systematically going through her mother's private journals. Decades of them, volumes of them, the most intimate record a person can leave, and copying out an edited version, and then burning the originals. Page by page, the private Victoria, the real one, was considered too much. Too human, too private to be allowed to survive. Tonight, we try to find her anyway. Let me take you back, to the spring of 1837, to a girl of 17, asleep in Kensington Palace, still, for a few more hours, simply herself. There is a dress in the archives, not a metaphor. An actual dress, black wool crepe, stiff at the collar, heavy enough that you would feel it in your shoulders within the hour. The dye was fixed with iron mordant, which gave it a particular cold smell, faintly mineral, faintly chemical, the smell of grief made permanent. It was the smell of Victoria's life for 40 years. She ordered it replicated, again and again, the same silhouette, the same weight, the same unrelenting black. Ladies in waiting who served her in the 1880s later described the particular sound it made when she moved through a room, a dry, heavy rustling, like something being dragged slowly across stone. That sound, that dress, that smell, that is where I want to begin, because I think it tells you something immediately about the distance between what we think we know about Queen Victoria and what she actually was. The image most of us carry, and I suspect you know exactly the image I mean, is of a small, severe, unsmiling woman in permanent mourning, rigid with decorum, the embodiment of an era that valued restraint above almost everything else, stone-faced, composed, a monument wearing a crown. That image is not entirely wrong, but it is so radically incomplete that accepting it as Victoria is like accepting a statue as a person. The statue was real. The woman inside it was more real, more complicated, more contradictory, more alive, and almost entirely hidden. That is what this is about. Not the monument. The woman the monument was built to conceal. The scale of the concealment is what I find genuinely staggering when I sit with it. Victoria was one of the most prolific writers in the history of the English language. The historian A.N. Wilson, in his biography of Victoria, estimated that she wrote somewhere in the region of 60 million words over her lifetime. Journals, letters, dispatches, marginalia, private memoranda. 60 million words. To put that in context, the complete works of Shakespeare run to approximately 884,000 words. Victoria wrote the equivalent of roughly 68 complete Shakespeares. She began keeping a journal at the age of 13 and continued, with only occasional interruption, until a few weeks before her death. She wrote to her eldest daughter Vicky nearly every day for decades, letters so intimate, so frank, so unguarded in their opinion of everyone from Gladstone to her own children, that they represent perhaps the most detailed private record any British monarch has ever left of themselves. And then her daughter Beatrice spent 30 years destroying it. That is not hyperbole. Following Victoria's explicit instructions, her youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice, who had been appointed the keeper of her mother's memory, transcribed the journals into a sanitized version and then burned the originals. 141 volumes. The historian Helen Rappaport, who has written extensively about Victoria's private life, described Beatrice's editorial work as an act of systematic erasure. What we have of Victoria's journals is Beatrice's version, tidied, shortened, stripped of the passages that were too raw, too angry, too personal, too much. The originals are gone, the fire took them. Other letters were burned by other hands. Correspondence with John Brown, her Highland servant and companion after Albert's death, was ordered destroyed. A memoir Victoria apparently wrote about Brown, which the biographer E.F. Benson later described as full of private feeling, was found and suppressed by her Dr. James Reed and her son, the Prince of Wales, before it could be published. Gone. The correspondence with Abdul Karim, her Indian secretary in the last decade of her life, was seized after her death and burned on the orders of her children. Gone. What we are left with is remarkable. There is still an extraordinary amount, but it is remarkable in the way that a partially burned library is remarkable. You can see the shape of what existed. You can sense the heat of what was lost. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the machinery of Victorian royal image-making, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, and because understanding it makes the private Victoria more poignant, not less. By the time Victoria came to the throne in 1837, the British monarchy was in genuine trouble. Her two immediate predecessors, George IV and William IV, had done considerable damage to the institution's reputation. George IV, in particular, had been corpulent, profligate, and so publicly dissolute that the public satirists of the era, Gilray, Cruikshank, had essentially made a sport of him. The monarchy needed rehabilitation. It needed to be seen to be decent, domestic, morally serious. And in Victoria, young, female, apparently simple in her tastes, it found the perfect vehicle. The machinery that shaped her public image was sophisticated and deliberate. Portraits were not painted from life and then simply displayed. They were negotiated. What angle? What expression? What symbolic objects in the frame? The painter Franz Xaver Winterhalter, who produced some of the most famous images of Victoria and her family, was not simply an artist. He was, in a very real sense, a brand manager. His paintings of the royal family in domestic settings, children clustered around parents, Albert's arm around Victoria's shoulder, were part of a conscious project to present the monarchy as something the middle class could recognize in themselves. Photography changed the game further. Victoria was one of the first monarchs to use photography extensively, and she understood its power instinctively, though she also found it destabilizing. A photograph, unlike a painting, cannot be entirely controlled. The camera caught her as she was, not as the painter was commissioned to render her. She reportedly disliked most photographs of herself, finding them too revealing. She was right, in a way. The photographs, especially those from the later years, have a quality that her painted portraits mostly lack. Something watching behind the eyes, something unsettled. The gap between public image and private reality was not incidental. It was the point. The monarchy required a symbol, and a symbol cannot be a full human being. The full human being, with her rages, her appetites, her obsessive attachments, her terror of childbirth, her longing for physical and emotional intimacy, her frankly startling sense of humor, had to be managed, controlled, suppressed, and ultimately, as far as possible, erased. Back with Victoria now, in that black dress, in that long, long life. There is a particular irony at the center of all of this that I find quietly unbearable, and I want to name it before we go further. We know an enormous amount about Queen Victoria. She is one of the most documented, most studied, most written about women in human history. There are thousands of books. There are television dramas and films. There are statues. Good Lord, there are statues, scattered across what was once the empire like dropped coins. We know the dates, the policies, the lineage, the official record in extraordinary detail. And yet the most honest words she ever wrote about herself are gone. The 60 million words she wrote were not all burned, but the most private of them, the most unguarded, the most truly her, were specifically targeted for destruction by the people who loved her most and feared her truth most completely. We have the monument. We have lost, in significant measure, the woman. What I want to do, across the time we have together tonight, is find her anyway, in what remains, in what the fires missed, in the fragments and the letters and the accounts of those who knew her, the ones who saw the dress come off at the end of the day, metaphorically speaking, and found underneath it someone startlingly, movingly, sometimes frighteningly alive. Because she was. She was genuinely, furiously, tenderly, imperfectly alive. And she deserves to be known. The palace breathes differently at 3 in the morning. That is the only way to describe it. The long corridors of Kensington Palace in the 1820s and 1830s held a particular kind of silence, not the comfortable silence of a house at rest, but something more careful than that, something more supervised. Stone floors, plaster walls gone slightly cold in the English night, the smell of tallow candles burned down to their sockets, and beneath that, always, the faint damp of a building that was old and a little unloved, drafts moving through rooms that had seen better kings and better centuries. And somewhere in those corridors, in a bedroom adjoining her mother's, a girl slept, or tried to. Alexandrina Victoria was never alone. Not once, not for a single hour of her childhood. I want to stay with that for a moment, because I think we can read those words and let them slide past us without their full weight landing. Never alone. Not when she dressed. Not when she ate. Not when she walked down a staircase. She was required to hold an adult's hand on the stairs at all times, a rule that persisted until she was in her teens. Not when she received visitors. Not when she studied. Not when she was ill and wanted simply to stare at the ceiling in her own company. Every room she entered, Someone else had entered first or entered with her. Every letter she wrote was read before it was sent. Every book she read was approved in advance. Her companions were chosen for her. Her friendships were monitored. She slept in her mother's bedroom until the night she became queen. She was, in almost every measurable sense, a prisoner, and her prison had carpets and music lessons and the occasional carriage ride through Hyde Park, and was called by the people who ran it, her education. The system had a name. It was called the Kensington System, and it was, the biographer Gillian Gill has argued, one of the most comprehensive and psychologically sophisticated instruments of control ever imposed on a royal child. Let me step back for a moment and tell you about this, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, and because the Kensington System is not a footnote to Victoria's story. It is, I would argue, the hidden foundation of almost everything else we will talk about in this series. It is where the private Victoria was first formed, first compressed, first taught what it meant to need. The architect of the system was not Victoria's mother, though the Duchess of Kent carried it out and gave it her name by proxy. The architect was a man named Sir John Conroy. Conroy was the comptroller of the Duchess's household, her financial manager, her secretary, her closest advisor, and, it was widely suspected, though never proven, her lover. He was charismatic and calculating in equal measure. He understood that the young princess represented an extraordinary concentration of future power, and he intended, quite deliberately, to position himself as the indispensable intermediary between that power and the world. If he could ensure that Victoria grew into adulthood completely dependent on her mother, on himself, on the small supervised world he had constructed around her, then when she became queen, that dependency would become his leverage. Now, I want to be precise here, because historians have been careful about the extent of Conroy's villainy. He was not simply a melodramatic schemer from a Victorian novel. He was a product of his time and his ambitions, a man of the minor Irish gentry who had attached himself to royalty and would not let go. But the effects of what he engineered were real and documented. The biographer Monica Charlotte, writing in the 1990s, and more recently Helen Rappaport, in her research into the early Victorian court, have both emphasised how deliberately the Kensington system was designed to prevent Victoria from forming any attachment or loyalty outside the household Conroy controlled. What made the system unusual, even by the standards of early 19th century aristocratic childhood, which were themselves hardly liberal, was its totality. Aristocratic girls of the period were certainly subject to strict supervision. They had governesses and chaperones and curricula designed to produce accomplishment rather than curiosity, but they had siblings, cousins, schoolrooms with other children, country houses where they could disappear into a garden for an hour and simply be. Victoria had none of this. She had her half-sister Theodore, who was older and who left for Germany when Victoria was 9. She had her governess, Lehzen, who genuinely loved her and who was one of the few kind forces in her childhood. She had her spaniel, Dash, and she had the walls. The particular cruelty of the Kensington system was not dramatic. It was ambient. It was the weight of constant observation, the knowledge that every word spoken might be reported, every expression noted, every preference catalogued and potentially used. The palace itself was not grand. Kensington in the 1820s was underheated, under-maintained, a second-hand sort of place that suited a second-hand sort of royal household. A widowed duchess without real standing living on a political margin. Victoria's rooms were modest. Her childhood furnishings were plain. She had a rocking horse she loved, and a collection of small figures she arranged and named with great seriousness, and a love of drawing and music that was genuine and enduring. She was not without joy, but the joy existed inside a container, and the container never opened. We cannot know with certainty what this did to her inner life during those years. The journals she began keeping at 13, prompted initially by Lehzen, were themselves subject to inspection. The early entries have a particular careful quality, a watched quality, as though even there she was composing herself for an audience. The historian David Duff, writing about the early journals, noted the stilted formality of many passages and suggested this was the natural result of a child who had never been taught to trust that her private thoughts were actually private. But here is what I find genuinely moving. Here is the moment I come back to, the moment the biographer Lynn Vallone has described as quietly extraordinary in what it reveals. On the morning of June 20th, 1837, a delegation arrived at Kensington Palace in the early hours before dawn, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain, with news that King William IV had died and that Victoria was now Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. She met them alone. She received them in her dressing gown. She was 18 years old. And then, when the initial formalities were concluded, she made her first request as Queen. She asked for 1 hour by herself. 1 hour. After 18 years of constant company, of hands held on staircases and letters read before sending, and rooms entered only in the company of others, the very first thing she did with sovereign authority was ask to be alone. Not to plan, not to pray necessarily, simply to be in a room without anyone watching. The records tell us she used that hour to write in her journal. What she wrote was not performed. There is a directness to that entry, a quality of genuine relief, that is quite different from the careful watched prose of the earlier volumes. I think about this more than I probably should. The enormity of what that single request tells us. This was a woman whose private self had been treated as a resource to be managed, a capacity to be channeled, a dependency to be manufactured. The cage they built around her was not made of iron. It was made of presence, of bodies in rooms, of footsteps always just behind, of the particular suffocation of being surrounded by people who needed you to remain small. She had spent 18 years inside it, and on the morning she became queen, before she did anything else, she closed a door. The journal begins, as most things in Victoria's life begin, with Leeson. The Baroness Louise Leeson, governess, keeper, the one constant in a childhood that was deliberately engineered to be lonely, is the one who first placed a blank book in the 11-year-old Princess Victoria's hands and said, in effect, write. Whether the instruction was Leeson's or her mother, the Duchess of Kent's, or some combination of both, the effect was the same. A small girl in a set of carefully managed rooms at Kensington Palace picked up a pen, pressed it to the first pale page, and began. She would not stop for 70 years. The journals she kept across that lifetime are, by most estimates, one of the most extraordinary archives in the history of British monarchy. The biographer Julia Baird, whose 2016 work on Victoria drew on sources that had been sealed or overlooked for decades, has described the sheer physical scale of them as almost impossible to fully comprehend. 141 volumes, 60 million words when you count the journals alongside the letters, the dispatches, the marginalia scrawled in the margins of state papers. The leather-bound volumes grew heavier across the years, thicker, more urgent. The handwriting shifted, the careful loops of girlhood becoming the compressed, emphatic strokes of a woman who had developed strong opinions and felt no particular need to make them small. I want you to hold that image for a moment, if you can. 141 volumes, a room full of a woman's inner life, accumulated over 7 decades, kept under varying degrees of secrecy, touching on everything from the tedium of a Wednesday afternoon audience to the night she learned she was queen, from the first time she danced with Albert to the last time she saw John Brown alive. The journals were, as far as we can tell, the one place where Victoria did not fully perform. They were the crack in the monument. I find this genuinely moving, not just because of what the journals contained, but because of what happened to them. The journals were kept in private, but they were never entirely private. This is one of the stranger ironies of Victorian intimate writing, and I want to step back for a moment and tell you something about the culture of journal keeping among women of rank in the 19th century, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising. Women who kept journals in Victoria's era were rarely writing in the expectation of true secrecy. The journal was understood to be a semi-public document. It was a form of self-cultivation, evidence of an interior life that was being properly attended to, properly shaped. Mothers read their daughters' journals. Governesses inspected them. Journals were sometimes shared deliberately as a form of communication, or kept in places where they could be discovered. The historian Amanda Vickery has noted that even the most apparently private female writing of the 19th century was often composed with a sense of a future reader looking over the shoulder, a parent, a husband, a biographer, God. Victoria was aware of this. She was always aware of this. The journals from her early years show a young woman writing at least partly for her mother's consumption, careful, compliant, recording her lessons and her walks and her gratitude. When she became queen, and the relationship with her mother began to fracture, the tone shifted. When Albert arrived and she began, as she wrote to her journal with evident relief, to have someone of her own, the voice became warmer, more private, more incautiously itself. But incautious only within limits. Even in the most intimate entries, Victoria knew she was a queen. She knew these books would outlast her. The question she couldn't fully answer, the question none of us can answer, writing anything down, was who would be reading them and what they would do. Back with Victoria now, with the specific fate of those 141 volumes. Because the answer to that question, when it came from her own daughter. Princess Beatrice, Victoria's youngest child, her last companion, the one who stayed when all the others married and dispersed across the courts of Europe. Beatrice was named in Victoria's will as the keeper of the journals. Victoria's instruction, as the biographer Helen Rappaport and others have recorded, was that Beatrice should transcribe them, edit them, and then burn the originals. Which she did. Over the course of roughly 2 decades, from shortly after Victoria's death in 1901 until around 1930, Beatrice sat. One imagines her in some quiet room, the light coming in at an angle, the smell of old leather and aged paper around her, and she read. She read her mother's life. She transcribed what she judged permissible, and she removed what she judged was not. The burning is the part that stays with me. Page by page, decade by decade. A woman destroying her mother's voice out of love, or something she understood as love, and out of duty, and out of the particular Victorian conviction that certain things should simply not be seen. What went into the fire? We cannot know with certainty, because what went into the fire is by definition gone. But historians have been able to make careful inferences. Rappaport, Baird, and others have noted that the surviving Beatrice transcripts show conspicuous gaps, entries that seem to skip days or weeks without explanation, references in letters to events that have no corresponding journal entry, emotional intensities that arrive without apparent cause. The most consistent pattern of removal, scholars believe, concerns 3 things: Victoria's relationship with John Brown, her feelings about her own children, and her interior life in the years immediately following Albert's death, the years when the grief went somewhere private and strange, and was never fully explained. What survives is still extraordinary, the fragments that Beatrice allowed to remain, either because she judged them safe or because she simply could not bring herself to remove everything, carry a voice that is startling in its unguardedness. Victoria describing the physical sensation of Albert's hand. Victoria recording her rage at a minister, with a directness that stops well short of diplomatic. Victoria noting, with the matter-of-fact precision of a woman who has simply decided to be honest in this one place, that she is tired, that she is afraid, that the weight of being looked at by the world is, on certain days, genuinely unbearable. There is a quality to that surviving voice, a kind of pressure behind it, as though even what remains is straining against its own containment, that makes the loss of the rest feel particularly acute. We cannot know what Beatrice felt, sitting with those volumes over 20 years. The historian A.N. Wilson, in his biography of Victoria, has suggested that Beatrice's editing was neither cynical nor simple, that she was genuinely trying to protect her mother's reputation in a world that she believed would not be kind to the unguarded woman behind the Queen. It is tempting to imagine her pausing over certain pages, reading something her mother wrote in grief or rage or tenderness, and simply not being able to offer it to the public record, not out of malice, out of something more complicated than malice. The strange intimacy of it, a daughter reading a mother's private mind, deciding what of that mind the world deserved to know, is one of those things that resists easy judgment. Beatrice was carrying out her mother's own instruction. Victoria asked for this, and yet the Victoria who asked for it was the public Victoria, the Queen, the monument, and the voice she had Beatrice burn was the other one. That other voice wrote 60 million words, and most of the honest ones are gone. The scratch of the pen, the smell of the ink, the slow filling of a leather cover across decades. And then, in a quiet room somewhere in the early 20th century, the smell of paper catching. The room smells of something medicinal and sweet. Not unpleasantly so, or not entirely. There is something underneath it, warm and slightly chemical, that catches at the back of the throat and then releases. It is the smell of chloroform, and it is the smell of 1853, and it is the smell of a queen giving birth to her 8th child in a room at Buckingham Palace, while a cloth is held, gently, to her face. She breathes in. She lets go. Let me tell you something about that moment, because I find it genuinely fascinating, not just as a historical fact, but as a kind of statement. Victoria had already given birth 7 times without anesthesia. 7 times she had gone through what she would later describe, in a letter to her eldest daughter Vicky, as being made to feel like, and these are her own words, recorded and preserved, like a cow or a dog, that phrase. The private voice of a woman being ferociously honest about her own body in an age that required women, and queens above all women, to be anything but. She was not supposed to have a body in that way. She was supposed to have a throne. But in 1853, for the birth of Prince Leopold, she asked for chloroform, and she used it. And then, which is the part that interests me most, she told people, let me step back for a moment and tell you something about that particular act of disclosure, because I think you'll find it genuinely surprising. By 1853, chloroform had existed as an anaesthetic for about 6 years. The Scottish physician James Young Simpson had introduced it in 1847, and almost immediately it became the centre of one of the more peculiar medical and religious debates of the 19th century. The argument against anaesthesia in childbirth ran, essentially, like this. Pain in labour was divinely ordained. It was written in Genesis, "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." And to eliminate it was to circumvent God's intention. The Calvinist theologian Thomas Chalmers, writing just before his death in 1847, had worried that medicine was interfering with a moral and spiritual process. There were doctors who agreed, who felt that pain served a purpose in childbirth, that it maintained alertness in the mother, that removing it was dangerous for reasons both spiritual and physiological. Simpson, to his credit, was not a man to let scriptural argument go unanswered. He pointed out, somewhat tartly, that when God put Adam into a deep sleep before removing his rib, that was itself a form of anesthesia, and that perhaps the Old Testament was more accommodating of the practice than its critics assumed. The medical profession remained divided. The debate was loud, occasionally absurd, and entirely real. And then Victoria used chloroform, and said so. The effect was immediate. The biographer Lytton Strachey, writing decades later, understood exactly what had happened. A queen had endorsed a practice, and that endorsement carried more practical weight than any theological argument. Within years, chloroform in childbirth had moved from the controversial to the commonplace, at least among those who could access it. Victoria had not intended to change medical history. She had simply, and privately, been a woman who had given birth 7 times without relief, and decided that the 8th time she would not. But the private decision, made public, became policy. The body of a queen, even a body she was not permitted to discuss, had shaped the bodies of thousands of women she would never meet. Back now to that room, back to the cloth and the sweetness and the release. Victoria's physical life was one of the most thoroughly hidden aspects of her private existence, and the hiding was not accidental. The Victorian era had constructed an image of female physicality that was simultaneously worshipped and denied. Women were to be pure, elevated, contained, their bodies symbolic rather than actual. A queen's body was required to be a monument. It could not be tired, it could not be hungry, it could not be in pain. It could not do the embarrassing, irreducible things that bodies do. And yet, Victoria's body did all of them, and with characteristic force. She was, by most accounts, a small woman, 5 feet tall or very close to it, but she carried herself with a physical presence that made the room readjust. Her voice, by the reports of those who heard it, was remarkable, clear, carrying, with a warmth in it that surprised people who had expected the icon and encountered the person. Her eyes, those famously direct, slightly protruding blue eyes, were described repeatedly as the most honest thing about her face. There was no hiding in them. What she felt, they apparently showed. She ate with extraordinary speed. This is one of those details I find genuinely delightful, because it is so specific and so completely at odds with the composed image. Victoria ate faster than anyone at her table, and because royal protocol required that no one continue eating after the sovereign had finished, this meant that state dinners, formal, elaborate, multi-course affairs representing the highest expression of imperial ceremony, frequently concluded with guests sitting in front of half-eaten plates while the footmen removed everything. The prime ministers of the most powerful empire in the world, diplomats, generals, archdukes, ate fast and left hungry. She simply could not slow down. It was, the historian A.N. Wilson has noted, one of her more endearing and exasperating physical habits, and there was nothing to be done about it. She had 9 pregnancies, 9 children carried and delivered between 1840 and 1857, 17 years during which her body was almost constantly pregnant or recently recovered from pregnancy, and she found the whole business, in her private correspondence, genuinely miserable. We can imagine the exhaustion of it, the particular bodily tedium, the sense of a physical life entirely commandeered by dynastic necessity. But we do not need to imagine, because she wrote it down. The biographer Gillian Gill, in her careful reading of Victoria's correspondence with Vicky, notes that Victoria was bracingly, almost shockingly honest with her daughter about the realities of pregnancy and childbirth, the loss of dignity, the physical vulnerability, the way it made her feel less herself. She loved her children most of the time, and separately, genuinely struggled with infants. The two things coexisted. She wrote to Vicky, when Vicky's own children began arriving, warning her with a frankness that reads across a century and a half as startlingly maternal, "This will be hard. Your body is not your own. No one will tell you this. I am telling you." That voice. I want to sit with it for a moment, because it is so different from the granite monument. It is worried and warm and specific and entirely human. The physical Victoria was kept from public view because the age required it. A queen who ate too fast, who hated being pregnant, who had asked for chloroform, who felt, on certain bad days, like a cow. This was not the Victoria the empire needed. The empire needed composure and symbol, and enduring marble stillness. So the letters were sealed, the conversations not recorded, the body made invisible behind the black silk dresses and the rigid public face. But the body was there. It was always there. Breathing in a room that smelled of something medicinal and sweet, letting go. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a household after something has broken. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of an empty room. The silence of people who are still breathing but who have stopped, entirely, making any sound that might be noticed. It is the silence of someone at a writing desk, setting down a pen with extreme care, of someone in a corridor near a closed door, deciding, without conscious thought, not to knock, of a fire that continues burning in a grate but seems, somehow, to be doing it more quietly than before. This is the silence that descended regularly across the great houses of Queen Victoria's reign, at Windsor, at Osborne, at Balmoral, in the aftermath of the Queen's temper. And it is one of the more extraordinary silences in British history, because it was produced every time by a woman who weighed less than 5 feet tall, and because virtually no record of it was allowed to survive. The host voice steps in here, and I want to be honest with you about something. When I first started spending serious time with Victoria, the journals, the letters, the biographies, the gaps between the biographies, what struck me first was not the grief, which is what most people lead with when they talk about her. It was not Albert, or the children, or the weight of the crown at 18. It was the temper, because the temper is, I think, one of the most suppressed facts in Victorian history. Not suppressed because it was shameful exactly, but suppressed because it was, and I want you to sit with this for a moment, evidence. Evidence that behind the icon there was someone who felt things at a genuinely extraordinary intensity, and that felt like a problem to almost everyone around her for almost her entire life. Let me stay with you in that room for a little while. The records are unambiguous on this point, which is itself remarkable because the records on Victoria were so thoroughly curated. Her daughter, Princess Beatrice, following Victoria's express instruction, spent years after the Queen's death systematically transcribing and destroying the original journals, softening, removing, redacting. And yet even through that filter, even in the sanitized versions that survived, the temper breaks through, because some things could not be entirely edited out of 60 million words. The biographer Julia Baird, in her 2016 work, Victoria the Queen, draws extensively on letters and journals that Beatrice left untouched, many of them held at the Royal Archives, and what emerges is a Victoria whose emotional life operated at a volume and intensity that contemporaries found genuinely alarming. She raged at her ministers. She raged at her children. She could silence a room with a look and rupture it with a word, and those who served her moved through her household with the particular alertness of people navigating a landscape where the ground might shift without warning. Prime Minister William Gladstone, whom Victoria despised with a fervour that never softened across their 4 separate periods of government, received the full weight of this. She found him, and the language is her own, though I am not quoting it directly, pompous, presumptuous, insufferably condescending. He reportedly once said that she had never been anything but a perfect lady in his presence. He said this as though it were a compliment. It wasn't, quite, because what it actually described was the extraordinary degree of control she could exercise when she chose to, and the equally extraordinary fact that the choice, often, was not to exercise it at all. Let me tell you about Lord Melbourne, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, and because it tells you something essential about the young Victoria that you carry forward into everything that comes after. William Lamb, the second Viscount Melbourne, was Victoria's first Prime Minister, and he was, this is not a metaphor, the most important man in her life before Albert. She was 18 when she ascended to the throne. She had been raised in the suffocating Kensington system, a regime of isolation and control, designed by her mother and the scheming Sir John Conroy to keep her dependent. She had almost no experience of the world outside that system, and into that isolation Melbourne arrived. He was 58, he was warm, worldly, gently amused by almost everything, and he saw her clearly, perhaps more clearly than anyone had. He understood that she had an enormous emotional appetite, and that it had been systematically starved. He understood that her temper, the flashes of cold fury that could crack through the surface without warning, was not a character flaw to be managed around, but a symptom of something deeper, a need for genuine engagement, for being taken seriously, for being met at the level of the feelings she was actually having. And so he met her there. He wrote to her constantly. He sat with her for hours. He explained the machinery of government to her with genuine patience. He told her, historian Lytton Strachey noted in his 1921 biography, things about the world that she had never been permitted to know. What Melbourne understood, and what would be understood in different registers by Albert, and then by John Brown, and then by Abdul Karim, was that the private Victoria required something specific. She required to be genuinely, fully present to someone who was not afraid of her, not performing calm at her, not managing her, not curating their response before she could feel it. Just there, real. When the Whig government fell in 1839 and Melbourne prepared to leave office, Victoria refused, initially, to replace the Whig ladies of her household with Tory ones, as convention required. This became the bedchamber crisis, studied in history courses as a constitutional incident, a question of precedent and prerogative. And it was that. But underneath the constitutional surface, something else was happening. She was terrified of losing Melbourne. She was 19 years old, and the man who had been the one genuine presence in her life was leaving, and the temper and the stubbornness and the refusal to yield on what seemed, from outside, like a procedural question, that was grief. Displaced and performed as political will, but grief. The biographer A.N. Wilson, writing in his 2014 study, Victoria, A Life, observes that her behaviour during the bedchamber crisis was not primarily a political calculation. It was a young woman using the one instrument she possessed, her constitutional authority, to hold on to someone she needed. The emotion and the institution were entirely tangled together. They would be for her entire life. Back with Victoria now, in the silence after the door closes. The household staff learned, they always did. There was a particular art to moving through Balmoral on a difficult day, knowing which corridors to use, which staircases to avoid, how to time the arrival of a document or a meal so that it did not land in the wrong moment. The ladies-in-waiting carried this knowledge the way people carry the map of a difficult terrain in the body rather than the mind. Automatically, constantly, without being entirely aware they are doing it. And I find this genuinely moving, in a way that is hard to fully articulate, because what the staff were navigating was not a monster. The records do not describe a tyrant, at least not most of the time. They describe someone whose emotional intensity was so far in excess of what the structures around her were designed to hold, that it kept finding its way out sideways. The same ferocity of feeling that produced the extraordinary, documented tenderness of her letters to her children in their grief, the same capacity, was what turned cold and cutting in the room before the letter was written. History chose to remember the love, the grief, the devotion. History quietly set aside the rage. And what troubles me about that, lying awake with her journals, is this. You cannot actually separate them. They are the same thing, coming from the same source. To suppress one was to flatten the other, to produce a monument instead of a person, a legend instead of a woman. The door at the end of the corridor remains closed. The fire in the grate continues, carefully, to burn. The rooms at Balmoral in the 1840s and 1850s smelled of pine resin and peat smoke, and something underneath both of those, a cold mineral sharpness that came off the Highland stone itself. The granite of the cairngorms carried into the walls and floors of the castle, holding the cold long after the fires had warmed the air. It was a smell unlike anything in the south of England, unlike Windsor or Buckingham Palace with their elaborate damp and their centuries of accumulated ceremony. Balmoral smelled like somewhere the world had not yet finished making. Victoria loved it for exactly that reason. So did Albert. And it is there, in those particular rooms, with the wind moving across the heather outside, and the fire snapping in the grate, and the smell of wet wool drying by the hearth, that I want you to picture them together, not as icons, not as the great love story of the Victorian age, as two people in a room, trying to find each other. because that is what this story actually is, and I think it is more interesting, genuinely, honestly more interesting, than the version we have been given. The official version of Victoria and Albert's marriage is, by any measure, one of the most powerful romantic narratives in the history of the British monarchy. Young Queen, barely 20, proposing to her German cousin in the Blue Closet at Windsor in October 1839. The tenderness of it, the smallness of the room against the enormity of what was happening. Two people who, by all accounts, experienced something real and immediate between them. The biographer A.N. Wilson, writing in Victoria, A Life, notes that the letters between them in the early years of their marriage have a quality of genuine urgency, not the performed affection of political alliance, but something that reads, across nearly 2 centuries, like two people surprised by what they have found in each other. But here is what the official version leaves out. Albert was, from the first day of his marriage, in an impossible position. He had no formal constitutional role. He was not the king. He was the Queen's husband. In an era that defined a husband's authority over his wife as near absolute, Albert's position was precisely inverted. He was the subordinate partner in the marriage in every sense that the law and the Constitution recognized. He could not vote in Parliament. He could not formally advise in matters of state. He was, in the eyes of much of the British political establishment, a foreign interloper, German, intellectual, suspiciously serious, with ideas about art and science and the improvement of things that struck the English aristocracy as rather relentlessly Teutonic. The times did not warm to him for years. Parliament was resistant, the public took longer still. And Victoria, for all that she loved him, and she did love him, the evidence of that is overwhelming and genuine, Victoria was also a queen. She had been a queen since she was 18 years old. She had opinions about her own authority. She was not, in the early years at least, disposed to hand it over simply because she had a husband. I want to be honest with you about something, because the tender version of this story tends to smooth over what was, by any careful reading of the primary sources, a marriage that had real friction in it. Real arguments. The kind of arguments that left ice in the room for hours afterward. Victoria had a temper that people who had never seen it could not quite believe. Her governess, Baroness Lazen, who had been the most important person in Victoria's childhood, described it in terms that suggest something close to alarm. The historian Walter Arnstein, in his study of Victoria's early reign, notes that she could go from warmth to fury with a speed that left even those closest to her momentarily uncertain of the ground beneath them. Albert, by contrast, ran cold in anger. He retreated. He wrote her letters from rooms in the same palace. Careful, considered letters, because he was a careful, considered person, and because face to face with Victoria's heat, he could not always reach her. She preserved many of these letters. She kept them all her life. The arguments were often about the same things, about her political meetings from which he was initially excluded, about his desire to be consulted, to be useful, to be something more than a decorative presence at formal dinners. About children, Victoria's well-documented and complicated relationship with pregnancy and motherhood, her sense that bearing 9 children had been done to her by a body she did not entirely control, her discomfort with infants, her preference for children once they could hold a conversation, and underneath all of it, something harder to name, the way that 2 very strong personalities, neither of whom had been taught to yield easily, were learning, year by year, how to share a life. Let me step back for a moment, because I want to tell you about the Great Exhibition of 1851, and I think you will find it genuinely surprising how much it illuminates what Albert's life actually cost him. The Great Exhibition was Albert's idea, his vision, his obsession, and his near undoing. The concept was extraordinary for its time. A vast international showcase of industry, technology, art, and manufacture, housed in a building of steel and glass that had never been built before, in Hyde Park, open to the world. Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace, as it became known, enclosed 19 acres of parkland and more than 1 million square feet of glass. 6 million people visited. It ran from May to October 1851, and it was, by almost any measure, a triumph of organization, imagination, and sheer human will. The will was Albert's. He chaired the Royal Commission. He corresponded with manufacturers, foreign governments, engineers, artists, and critics. He navigated a parliament that was deeply sceptical, a press that mocked the whole enterprise as vanity, and a public that predicted catastrophe. He did this while continuing to serve as Victoria's private secretary in all but name, managing her correspondence, attending her audiences, advising her on the political questions that now, finally, he was permitted to help address. He was doing, by any honest account, 2 full-time jobs simultaneously. The biographer Gillian Gill has noted that by the early 1850s, Albert was showing signs of the chronic exhaustion that would, within a decade, become something more serious. He suffered from stomach complaints. He slept badly. He told those close to him that he found it difficult to recover from illness the way he once had. And still, when the exhibition closed, the credit went to the age rather than the man. It became Victorian. The adjective absorbed the achievement. Albert received the gratitude of his wife, the appreciation of some parts of the press, and the quiet resentment of the establishment he had outperformed. He was 42 years old when he died in December 1861. He had been working at that pace for 20 years. Back with Victoria now, in those Balmoral rooms, the fire, the peat smoke, the wind off the hill. What the records suggest, and the biographer Helen Rappaport, in her detailed account of Albert's final years, has written about this with particular care, is that within the marriage itself, something had shifted and deepened over time in a way that the early friction had not predicted. Victoria had yielded, gradually and with considerable resistance, to a genuine partnership. Albert had become not simply her husband but the structural centre of her interior life, the person who knew her entirely, who could meet her anger without flinching, who could write her a letter from the next room and have it change the temperature of the whole day. The historian Lytton Strachey, writing in his 1921 Queen Victoria, suggested that the relationship had achieved by the 1850s a kind of self-contained world, 2 people who had built, between them, something that required both of them to stand. We cannot know, of course, what Albert felt in his quietest moments. The records hint at a man who was genuinely lonely, in a way that his marriage, for all its real warmth, could not entirely address. A man brilliant enough to see exactly what he was, and was not, permitted to be. A man in a foreign country who had given everything he had to a role that history was never quite sure how to name. What we do know is that he was irreplaceable, and that Victoria knew it too, and that the life she was living in those rooms at Balmoral, the particular warmth of that particular fire, the particular sound of his breathing in the room beside her, was the architecture of everything she understood as solid. The Blue Room at Windsor smelled of camphor and coal smoke and something underneath both of those things that the family recognised and did not speak aloud. It was the 14th of December, 1861. The candles had been burning for hours. Outside, the winter dark was absolute, the kind of English December dark that has no softness in it, only weight, only the particular pressing quality of cold against old stone. Inside, the room was warm and quiet in the way that sick rooms are quiet, which is not peaceful but suspended, held in place by the shallow sound of one man's breathing. Albert Francis Charles Augustus Emmanuel, Prince Consort, was 42 years old and dying. He had been ill for weeks. The official diagnosis was typhoid fever, though some historians, including the biographer A.N. Wilson, who examined the medical records closely, have suggested that his constitution had been progressively failing for some time beforehand, worn down by the extraordinary weight of work he had carried, by the German winters of his boyhood perhaps, by what Wilson and others have described as a kind of constitutional fragility that Victoria herself had never wanted to see. He had been losing weight, He had struggled to sleep. He had moved from room to room in Windsor in the preceding days, unable to find comfort in any of them, too restless for rest. And Victoria had watched all of this and had refused, with something approaching ferocity, to believe what she was watching. I want to say something about that refusal, because I find it genuinely important, not as a criticism of her, but as a window into something real about who she was. The records are clear that Victoria did not accept, until the very end, that Albert was going to die. The physicians around her were careful. They were also afraid of her. The historian Giles St. Aubyn, in his biography of Victoria, described the way the royal household moved around her on the subject of Albert's illness. The careful language, the qualified reassurances, the deliberate softening of prognoses. But we can also imagine, reading between the lines of Victoria's own letters from this period, that she was not simply deceived. She was, in some deeper sense, constitutionally unable to conceive of a world in which Albert was not present. He had been at the centre of everything for 21 years. He had been her first friend, in a childhood that had been almost entirely without friends. He was the person around whom her entire emotional architecture had been built, beam by beam, since she was 20 years old. The biographer Gillian Gill has written about the particular nature of Victoria's dependence on Albert, not as weakness, but as the single great emotional act of her life, the one place where she had allowed herself to be, simply, a person rather than a queen. To imagine him gone was, in some sense, to imagine the house itself removed, leaving only the sky where walls had been. She went in and out of the blue room, throughout the day of the 14th. She held his hand. The hand was thin now in ways it had not been. She kissed his face. The children were brought in, some of them. The Prince of Wales, Bertie, whom Albert had so recently and so sternly reprimanded over a romantic scandal at Cambridge, a reprimand that Victoria would later, in her grief, irrationally and repeatedly blame for Albert's decline, was there. Alice, the daughter who had been closest to her father, who had read to him in the days before and translated his requests to the doctors when his voice was too weak, was there. The room held the sound of breathing, the faint hiss of the fire, the weight of everyone's held attention. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about Victorian mourning culture, because I think it is genuinely necessary here, and because I find it one of the more quietly remarkable things about the era this woman both embodied and exceeded. The Victorians had developed, by the middle of the 19th century, an extraordinarily elaborate vocabulary of grief. Death was not hidden. It was ritualized, codified, made visible and formal in ways that are almost unrecognizable from the distance of our own century, where death tends to be managed away from sight. The Victorians brought it into the room. They photographed their dead. It was common practice to arrange a body, dress it, prop it in a chair or a bed, and have a photograph taken, sometimes the only photograph that existed of that person. They kept locks of hair pressed into lockets, woven into brooches, set under glass. They wore black for prescribed periods, full mourning, then half mourning, the gradations careful and socially enforced. They designed jewelry from jet. They draped mirrors. The funeral industry had industrialized grief into something almost baroque in its attention to form. And Victoria both drew on all of this and went so far beyond it that even by the standards of her own culture she alarmed people. She would photograph Albert's body. She would have a cast taken of his hand, plaster still carrying the warmth of him, or almost so, and she would keep it close for the rest of her life. She would have his clothes laid out each morning, every morning, for 40 years, as though he might come back to put them on. But I am getting slightly ahead of the story. Back to the 14th of December. At 10 minutes to 11 in the evening, Albert's breathing changed. The records are quiet about exactly who said what in those final minutes. Victoria later wrote in her journal, and her journal entry from that night survives, in her own hand, the writing uneven, that she took his dear left hand and placed it against her cheek, that she called out his name, that he gave a few gentle breaths, and then he was still. She was 42 years old. What happened in the hours immediately following is, I think, one of the most genuinely difficult things in the historical record of this woman's private life. Not because it was unusual exactly. Grief is grief. It does what it does. But because of the scale of it, and because of what it revealed about the structure underneath. Victoria screamed. It was not composed. It was not dignified. The accounts of those present, filtered through the careful language of Victorian correspondence, but legible even through that filter, describe something raw and total, a person simply broken open. She had to be physically held. She called for Albert. She was taken from the room and could not be persuaded to let go of the hands that led her. The children, her own children, did not know what to do with her. Alice, who was herself devastated, found herself mothering her mother in a way that would continue, at intervals, for years. And then the public machinery began. Albert's death was announced. The nation was informed. The apparatus of state mourning was set in motion. Black crepe appeared in shop windows. Newspapers bordered their pages in black. Condolences arrived from every court in Europe. And Victoria, the Victoria the public would see, became the figure of composed, dignified, monumental bereavement that the era wanted and expected, and that history has largely accepted. But the private Victoria, the one nobody was allowed to see, was something else entirely. The biographer Lytton Strachey, who wrote Victoria's life in 1921, and who was not sympathetic in the way that later biographers have been, nevertheless captured something true when he described her grief as less an emotion than an atmosphere, something total and structural, something that rearranged the interior of her life the way an earthquake rearranges a landscape. She was 42. She would live to 81. That is 40 more years, 40 more winters, 40 more Christmases at Windsor and Balmoral and Osborne, every one of them arranged around the absence of one specific man. She chose to spend every one of those years in formal mourning. And I find myself sitting with that particular detail longer than I probably should, because it is both a genuine expression of a love that was real and total, and something else, something harder to name, a cage perhaps, a structure rebuilt from grief the way the original structure had been built from love, different materials, the same enclosure. The mourning ritual began before dawn. Somewhere in the cold interior of Windsor Castle, a servant was already moving through the dark, carrying hot water up the back stairs, past the closed doors, toward the room that had been Prince Albert's dressing room. Not Victoria's, his. The water was set down on the washstand. Fresh towels were laid out. His clothes were arranged, as they had been arranged every morning since December 14th, 1861, in the precise order he had preferred them. His shaving things were set. His writing desk, in the rooms where he had worked and read and sat in the evenings, remained exactly as he had left it. Papers arranged as though he might return to them, pen uncapped, the small private objects of his working life preserved with the stillness of a museum that no member of the public would ever be permitted to enter. The smell of those rooms, in the years after his death, must have been particular. Not quite the smell of occupation, not quite the smell of abandonment, the smell of something held in suspension, preserved, slightly airless. A shrine smell, if shrines had the warmth of recent human habitation still haunting them, slowly cooling through the years. Victoria knew every detail of this ritual. She had ordered it. She maintained it with a ferocity that the household learned very quickly not to question. And she was, in the mornings, mostly alone. I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further into this particular decade of Victoria's life. The official Victorian narrative of widowhood, the composed queen in her black dress, the dignified grief, the dignified carrying on in the name of duty, is one of the most thorough misrepresentations in the entire historical record of this woman. What actually happened in the years following Albert's death was something rawer and stranger and more human than that. It was a kind of collapse, Not a dramatic, visible collapse, something quieter and in some ways more disturbing than that. An interior collapse that she built elaborate walls around, and that the court, the family, and eventually history conspired to paper over with the language of composure. The private Victoria of this period is someone in genuine psychological distress. I think it matters to say that plainly, because the story we have been told is not that story. She had worn black every day since the morning they told her. That was not unusual. Long mourning periods were the custom of the age. But Victoria's mourning did not follow the custom of the age in its duration. It did not soften at 1 year, or 2, or 5. It calcified. It became structural. The black dress became the only dress. The portrait of Albert, the death portrait, made from his face the morning after, was reproduced and hung in nearly every room she used. A cast of his hand sat on her dressing table. When she moved between her residences, as she did seasonally, Windsor, Balmoral, Osborne, the precise arrangement of his things travelled with her was reconstructed in each place. The biographer Lytton Strachey, writing in 1921, described the atmosphere of the royal household in these years as something close to suffocation, a court organised not around the business of governance or the rhythms of ordinary institutional life, but around the single gravitational fact of a dead man. She stopped appearing in public in any meaningful way, not partially, almost entirely. The weekly audiences continued, and she still conducted the business of government. She was never, her defenders have always been right to insist, negligent in that. But the ceremonial presence that the public expected from its monarch, the appearances, the processions, the visible occupation of the role, these she withdrew from with a comprehensiveness that shocked her ministers and alarmed her family. Gladstone, who became Prime Minister for the first time in 1868, found the situation nearly ungovernable. He wrote to members of the cabinet about it. He appealed to her, in the careful and elaborate language that her position required, to return to public visibility. He understood, he told her, and he may genuinely have believed it, that her grief was profound and real. But the nation needed to see its monarch. The institution required it. She was, as he put it in the register of Victorian political rhetoric, a trust held for the people. She was unmoved. Her secretary, General Grey, and later Henry Ponsonby, spent years navigating the gap between what she would do and what ministers and public alike required of her, translating, softening, managing, absorbing her rages when her seclusion was challenged. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about what was happening in the country during these years, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising. The Republican movement in Britain in the late 1860s and early 1870s, the period when Victoria's withdrawal from public life was at its most extreme, was not a small fringe. It was a real political force, and for a few years it represented something close to a genuine crisis of confidence in the monarchy as an institution. Pamphlets circulated in London and the industrial cities of the north that were direct and sometimes savage in their criticism. The most famous of them, "What Does She Do With It?" was published in 1871, and its title referred to the civil list, the money paid from the public purse to maintain the royal household. If the Queen would not be seen, if she would not perform the visible functions for which she was maintained at enormous public expense, then what, exactly, was the argument for maintaining her at all? The pamphlets sold in very large numbers. The politician Charles Dilke gave a speech in Newcastle in 1871 that was essentially a reasoned case for a republic, and he was not a marginal figure. He was a rising member of the Liberal Party, widely respected, and the reception his speech received suggested he was speaking for a real constituency of public feeling. Sir Charles Dilke was not alone. There were meetings, there were petitions. The Tomahawk, a satirical magazine, published a cartoon of an empty throne with the caption, "Where is Britannia?" Republicanism was, in those years, something that serious people argued for in serious terms, and the reason, the primary reason, was that the monarch had disappeared. What pulled the institution back from that edge was not, in the end, political persuasion. It was illness. In late 1871, the Prince of Wales contracted typhoid fever, the same disease believed to have killed Albert, and came terrifyingly close to death. Victoria's grief-soaked withdrawal, for a moment, became publicly comprehensible. A mother fearing the loss of her son to the same illness that had taken her husband. The public sentiment shifted almost overnight. When the prince recovered, there was a national service of thanksgiving at St. Paul's, and Victoria appeared, and the crowd's reception was overwhelming. The Republican moment passed. But it had been real. Back now with Victoria, in the private interior of those long years before that moment. What did it cost the people around her? This is the detail I find myself returning to, not Victoria's grief itself, which was real and which deserves its full weight, but the particular loneliness of the household that formed around it. Her children navigated a mother who was entirely present in her grief, and mostly elsewhere for them. The biographer A.N. Wilson, in his 1992 study of Victoria, noted that the children experienced something strange in those years. A mother who was physically present in the residences, whose requirements structured every hour of every day, but who was in some fundamental sense not reachable. She needed, without end, and what she needed was not them, it was him. What she needed was the one person who could not be provided. The records suggest, and we should be careful here, because interior states are always inference, that Victoria herself may have understood this. That somewhere beneath the elaborate machinery of preserved rooms and ordered rituals, she knew that what she was doing was not moving through grief, but living inside it. The journalist and cultural historian Matthew Sweet has observed that Victoria's relationship with her grief took on a quality of ownership, grief as identity, grief as the truest possible expression of love, grief as the one place where Albert remained fully real to her. She had chosen to live there, and the house she had built around that choice was very, very cold. The cold at Balmoral is a particular kind of cold, not the flat, damp cold of London, not the bone-grey cold of Windsor in February. This is the cold of the Scottish Highlands in autumn, a cold with a smell to it, peat and heather and something mineral, the cold of a landscape that has never especially concerned itself with human comfort. The hills go dark early, the River Dee moves fast and black between its stones, wood smoke drifts from the estate buildings and hangs low over the gravel. A horse shifts its weight somewhere nearby, and in the morning, before the household has properly woken, before the letters and the dispatches and the ministers and the machinery of empire has begun its daily grinding, a small woman in black descends a stone staircase and steps out into that cold air, and a man is already waiting. His name is John Brown. He is standing by the horse, his hand on the bridle, his breath visible in the Highland morning. He is 43 years old, broad-shouldered, with a red beard and the weathered complexion of a man who has spent his entire life outdoors. He does not bow deeply. He does not perform the elaborate deference that everyone else in Victoria's proximity performs as a matter of survival. He says, and he will say it for 20 years, to the Queen of the United Kingdom, the Empress of India, the most powerful monarch on earth, simply what he thinks. He calls her the Queen. Sometimes he calls her, famously, woman. He tells her when she has stayed out too long in the rain. He tells her when she is wrong. He tells her when she ought to go inside. No one else in her life does this. No one else is allowed to. I find this detail genuinely startling every time I return to it. Not just that she tolerates it, but that she seems to have needed it, almost hungrily. Here is a woman who commands an empire, who can silence a prime minister with a look, who has given birth 9 times and buried a husband, and conducted correspondence with virtually every crowned head in Europe. And the relationship she guards most fiercely, the one she fights her own family to preserve, is with a Scottish gillie, who speaks to her like she is a person rather than a monument. Think about what that tells you about the weight of being the monument. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the Gilly tradition, because I think you'll find it genuinely surprising and because it is essential to understanding why this relationship was so radical, so threatening in its social context. The Gilly. The word comes from the Scottish Gaelic, meaning simply a lad or a servant, was a particular kind of Highland attendant. His role was outdoor, physical, essentially masculine work, guiding fishing parties, attending hunts, managing horses and dogs, and the whole logistics of Highland sporting life. The Gilly occupied a curious social position in Victorian Scotland. He was a servant, absolutely, but he was also, in a sense, the master of his terrain, the man who knew the land, the weather, the deer. On a grouse moor or a Highland riverbank, the Gilly's knowledge was more useful than the aristocrat's status, and both parties understood this. The relationship had a certain pragmatic equality baked into it, at least outdoors, at least on the hill. John Brown had served the royal household at Balmoral since 1849. Prince Albert had specifically valued him. He was trusted with the horses. He was trusted with the Queen's safety on difficult ground. He was, by multiple accounts, completely competent, completely loyal, and entirely unimpressed by social performance. When Victoria summoned him south in 1864, 3 years after Albert's death, and made him her permanent personal attendant, not just at Balmoral but everywhere, at Windsor, at Osborne, on trips to Europe, she was doing something the Victorian class system had no framework for. She was importing a working relationship that had its own particular logic in Highland Scotland and placing it in the heart of the English court, where every relationship was measured by rank, by distance, by the precise gradations of who stood where and who said what. The court was horrified. The newspapers were worse. They called her Mrs. Brown. They wrote satirical pamphlets. A Republican broadsheet suggested she had lost her reason. Her own children, or several of them, petitioned her. Her household staff resented him openly. Brown was given a bedroom near hers. He oversaw access to her person. He managed her schedule. He knew, often before her secretaries did, what mood she was in, and whether today was a day when the Queen would see anyone at all. Back with Victoria now, back at Balmoral, in that early morning cold, because here is the thing the court's outrage kept obscuring. The relationship worked. Whatever it was, and I want to be careful and honest here, because the nature of the relationship has been debated seriously by historians for more than a century, and the evidence does not settle it cleanly. It gave her something she had been without since Albert's death. The biographer Julia Baird, in her deeply researched 2017 study, Victoria, the Queen, argues that Brown represented for Victoria something close to an anchor, a person who was simply present, who treated her private feelings as real, who did not need her to be the Queen every moment of every day. We cannot know whether the relationship was physical. The letters that might have told us, the journals covering the years of their closest friendship, were destroyed. Her daughter Beatrice, who was tasked with editing and transcribing Victoria's journals after her death, removed or redacted passages covering this period. A memoir Victoria had been writing about Brown was destroyed after her death, almost certainly on the instructions of her son, the Prince of Wales, who would become Edward VII. The erasure was systematic and deliberate. What we do have is the material record. The photographs. She kept photographs of Brown on her desk alongside the photographs of Albert. When she was unwell, it was Brown who sat with her. He managed her medication, her wheelchair on difficult ground, her comfort in the long evenings. When he died, in March 1883, unexpectedly, from an infection, at Windsor, Victoria was devastated in a way that alarmed even people who had watched her grieve Albert. She wrote in her private journal that she had lost her best and most faithful friend. She wore mourning for him. She kept a cast of his hand. She kept his possessions in her rooms. And then, and this is the detail I keep returning to, the one that sits with me in a way I find difficult to fully articulate, she gave specific instructions about her own burial. She was to be buried with certain objects. Some were Albert's, a cast of his hand, his dressing gown, a lock of his hair, but tucked into her left hand, placed there at her request by her physician Sir James Reed, was a photograph of John Brown. The biographer Helen Rappaport has documented this in careful detail. Victoria had given Reed the instructions privately. She had asked that the photograph be concealed, covered by flowers before the family viewed the body. Her own children did not see it. The private Victoria, reaching past the monument one last time, holding in her dead hand the image of the man who had spoken to her plainly. That is not a minor gesture. That is a woman telling the truth, finally, about who mattered to her in the silence, and that it had to be concealed even then, even from her children, even in the coffin, even in death, tells you everything about the machinery of erasure that had operated around her for 20 years. John Brown was loved, possibly more deeply than most of her world was prepared to admit, and the court and the family and the newspapers and the institution did what institutions do when a private truth threatens a public image. They destroyed the evidence, and they almost succeeded. There is a particular smell that Abdul Karim brought with him into Victoria's world, and I find myself returning to it whenever I think about this part of her story. Spices, cardamom and cumin carried in cloth, the faint sweetness of rosewater on fabric. In the great stone corridors of Balmoral Castle, all tartan and antler and cold Highland draught, this smell was something entirely foreign, something that did not belong, something that the household around Victoria found, in ways they expressed with varying degrees of contempt, profoundly discomforting. Victoria, by all surviving accounts, found it beautiful. He arrived in 1887. His full name was Muhammad Abdul Karim, and he was 24 years old when he came to England as one of 2 Indian attendants sent to serve at Victoria's Golden Jubilee celebrations. He had been born in Jhansi, the son of a hospital assistant. He was tall. He was, by every account that survives, possessed of a particular kind of presence, composed, dignified, confident in a way that the household found immediately threatening and Victoria found immediately compelling. He had been sent to wait at table. Within months, Victoria had elevated him to a role no one around her had anticipated or sanctioned. She made him her Munshi, her teacher. He began teaching her Urdu and Hindustani. She, the Empress of India, who had presided over an empire of 300 million souls for more than a decade without, it must be said, learning a single word of any of its languages, now sat down each day with this young man from Jhansi and learned to write in a script she had never encountered before. The biographer, Shrabani Basu, whose research on this relationship in her book, Victoria and Abdul, remains the most thorough and careful account we have, has documented the evidence of these lessons in the surviving records. Victoria's Hindustani exercise books exist. Her handwriting in Urdu script, careful, effortful, the letters of someone learning something genuinely difficult late in life, survives. She was 68 years old. She was in the grip of everything that old age and 45 years of widowhood had done to her body and her spirit, and she sat there and learned. I find this genuinely moving. I find it moving in the way that any act of genuine curiosity in old age is moving. She did not have to do this. No one expected her to do this. In fact, the entire court expected precisely the opposite, that she would maintain her ceremonial remove from her Indian subjects as she had always maintained it, treating India as an abstraction of empire rather than a place inhabited by actual human beings with languages and histories of their own. Instead, she learned to write his language. She asked him to tell her about his country. She began, late in her life and possibly for the first time, to develop something like a genuine relationship with India as a place, as a living culture, rather than as a jewel in an imperial crown. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the India that Abdul Karim came from, because I think it deserves to be said clearly, and because the irony of it is one of those things that history can sometimes only hold in silence. By 1887, the British Raj was at its height. India had been under direct British Crown rule for 30 years, following the suppression of the 1857 uprising, a suppression that had been brutal beyond the comfortable reach of most Victorian drawing rooms. The subcontinent was being administered as a resource, its labour exploited, its railways built for British strategic purposes, its famines managed with what the historian Mike Davis has described, in his devastating account of this period, as a systematic indifference that killed tens of millions. The famines of the 1870s and 1890s, the ones that fell across Victoria's reign like shadows, were not simply natural disasters. They were, Davis has argued, the intersection of climate and colonial economic policy, and they killed people in numbers that the empire preferred, and largely managed not to count too carefully. Victoria knew something of India's troubles. She received dispatches, she read reports. She was not uninformed, but the India she knew was, inevitably, the India that the Raj wished her to know, filtered through viceroys and officials and the vast machinery of imperial self-presentation. Abdul Karim was something different. He was, in the most literal sense, a person from that place. He had opinions about the treatment of Muslims in India. He had family there. He had a perspective. And Victoria, this is what the household found so alarming, listened. She began to write in her journal about the concerns he raised with her. She began to push back against some of the more dismissive characterizations of Indian people that circulated freely in the language of the court around her. The historian Lucy Worsley, in her biography of Victoria, has noted the way that the Karim relationship opened something in Victoria's late-life thinking about empire. Not a repudiation, not a political awakening in any modern sense, but a genuine complication, a recognition perhaps that the people over whom she presided were not abstractions. The Empress of India, at the end of her life, was receiving that information from one specific Indian man who had become, in every practical sense, her closest companion. Back with Victoria now, in those particular years of the 1890s, Karim had acquired, by then, a suite of rooms at each of the royal residences. He had a cottage at Balmoral. Karim Cottage. It was called, and at Osborne. Victoria fought, repeatedly and with considerable force, for his right to be treated with dignity by the household. When the household objected to his eating with the royal servants, which they did, vociferously, she overruled them. When her own children complained about his presence and influence, she wrote to them with a sharpness that the surviving letters preserve without softening. The household's objections were not, it must be said, primarily about propriety in any abstract sense. They were about race. Biographer Shrabani Basu is unambiguous on this point, and the language of the household's internal correspondence makes it difficult to reach any other conclusion. The ladies-in-waiting, the equerries, the physicians, all the machinery of the court, used language about Abdul Karim in their private letters and diaries that belongs to the most dehumanizing vocabulary of imperial racism. Victoria's defense of him was, among other things, a refusal of that vocabulary. Whether she would have articulated it in those terms, we cannot know, but the pattern of her behavior is clear. We can imagine, and the records invite us to imagine, what those daily lessons meant to her. Urdu script moving under her pen, a young man's patient voice in a warm room while outside the Highland wind worked at the stone. The particular intimacy of learning from someone, the vulnerability of it, the trust it requires. She had not trusted easily since Albert died. The records suggest she found, in Karim's company, something she had not found since, the feeling of being genuinely known, genuinely regarded, by another human being, without the performance the role required. She called him, "My dear Munshi." In her diary, she recorded his presence with a warmth that the diary rarely extended to members of her own family. When she died, In January 1901, Edward VII arrived at Osborne and within days ordered that Abdul Karim's letters and photographs be surrendered and destroyed. Edward had despised the relationship during his mother's lifetime. Now he acted quickly. The bonfire was thorough. Some things survived: a handful of photographs, the Hindustani exercise books, the journal entries that were already too widely copied to be recalled. But the letters between them, whatever private things they had written to each other across 14 years, are gone. Not lost, burned. The same story as John Brown, the same response from the court, the same fire, the same erasure. As if the institution around Victoria could not bear, even after her death, the evidence of who she had actually needed. The paper is almost impossibly thin. That is the first thing you notice, if you have ever held a letter that is 150 years old. Not the faded ink, not the careful copper plate, not the date written in the upper right-hand corner, in a hand that is somehow both formal and urgent at once. The paper itself. It has the quality of something that has learned, over time, to become less substantial. To hold it is to be aware, very precisely, of the fact that you are holding something that could simply stop existing, that the pressure of your fingers is a kind of threat. Victoria wrote on exactly this kind of paper, thin, cream-coloured, often edged in black after Albert died. She maintained mourning stationery for the remaining 40 years of her widowhood. Her handwriting was small and slanted, and moved quickly across the page, the letters leaning forward as if in a hurry to say the next thing. She used a particular heavy black ink. She pressed firmly. Even now, in the archives and the published collections and the letters held in careful acid-free folders, you can sometimes feel the impression of her pen on the back of the page, a kind of ghostly braille, the physical pressure of what she was trying to say. I find this genuinely moving. The idea that the force of what a person needed to express leaves a mark you can feel rather than see, that the paper remembers something the words have to work harder to convey. What survived the burning tells us everything we need to know about who she really was. Let me tell you about the correspondence between Victoria and her eldest daughter, because I think you will find it one of the most extraordinary epistolary relationships in recorded history, and because its survival, when so much else was deliberately destroyed, is the thing that makes this portrait possible at all. Victoria Vicky, formerly Princess Victoria, the Princess Royal, later Crown Princess of Prussia, and eventually German Empress, for a brief and tragic 99 days before her husband Friedrich died of throat cancer in 1888, left England in January 1858 to marry Prince Friedrich Wilhelm of Prussia. She was 17 years old. She had never lived away from her family. The marriage was politically necessary and personally, it turned out, genuinely loving. But she was going somewhere cold and strange and foreign, to a court that would never quite accept her English ways, to a country whose language she was still learning, among people who would spend the next several decades treating her as an outsider. Victoria wrote to her almost immediately, and then kept writing, nearly every day for the next 40 years. The historian Michaela Reed and the editors of the published correspondence, Roger Fulford's landmark series, Dearest Child, Dearest Mama, Your Dear Letter, Darling Child, and Beloved Mama, published across the 1960s and 70s, drew on the thousands of letters that survived to produce what amounts to a private record of extraordinary intimacy and candor. In these letters, Victoria said things she said nowhere else. She complained about her ministers by name and with genuine venom. She described her physical ailments with a directness that would have horrified her public. She confessed her fears. She admitted her failures as a mother. She raged against the conditions of women's lives, against pregnancy, against the loss of self that came with repeated childbearing, in terms that were startlingly modern and that coexisted, without apparent discomfort, alongside her deep conservatism in other matters. She wrote about Albert. She wrote about Brown. She wrote, sometimes, about nothing in particular, about the weather at Balmoral. about a horse that had gone lame, about a piece of music she had heard and liked. And in the nothing in particular letters, as much as in the great confessional ones, you feel the shape of a real person, someone who needed to talk, who needed to be heard, who found in the act of writing to this particular daughter something that the rest of her extraordinary life did not give her, a witness. Back with Victoria herself now, and the letters more broadly. The correspondence with Vicky is the most substantial surviving record of Victoria's private voice, but it is not the only one. Her journals, or what survived them, give us something different. The originals were largely destroyed by Princess Beatrice, who was tasked by her mother with copying them out in expurgated form, removing what Beatrice considered too personal or too raw, and then burning the originals. Scholars have estimated that Beatrice destroyed approximately half of the original journal content. What remains is a filtered version, still astonishing in its scope, still rich with detail, but shaped by a daughter's sense of what her mother should have been allowed to say. The letters to Vicky escaped this particular machinery of suppression because they were in Germany. They passed, on Vicky's death in 1901, to her daughter, and then through a complicated archival history before eventually being secured. They were not available to Beatrice. They were not available to Edward. They survived. And what they survived to tell us is this: Victoria's truest self emerged in letters, in the private channel of ink on thin paper, carried by messenger or post, received by one trusted person in a room on the other side of whatever sea or border separated them. This was the only space in her life that approximated freedom. She was never alone. She had ladies in waiting and dressers and attendants and equerries. There was always someone in the room, always someone standing just outside the door, always someone watching the Queen of England for signs of what the Queen of England needed next. But in a letter, she could turn her back on all of it. She could be, for the length of a page, ungoverned. We cannot know exactly what she felt in those moments of writing, but the biographer Lytton Strachey, whose 1921 Queen Victoria remains one of the most penetrating portraits of her character, despite its obvious ironies, sensed something like relief in the private documents. And the scholar Helen Rappaport, whose work on Victoria's emotional life is among the most careful and sympathetic modern scholarship on the subject, has written of a woman who lived in a state of sustained emotional intensity that had almost nowhere to go, and who found in her closest correspondences something like a pressure valve. Not therapy, not confession in any formal sense, simply, and this is the word that seems most right, expression, the permission to say what was true. What was true, in the letters, was various and sometimes contradictory. She was a woman who could write with genuine warmth about her grandchildren, and then, in the next letter, describe a political rival with a savagery that would have ended careers if it had ever become public. She was someone who understood with great sophistication the difference between the image she was required to maintain and the feelings she actually had, and who maintained that difference with extraordinary discipline in public, and then released it, in ink, in private. There is something in that discipline worth sitting with, the sustained effort of it, 63 years of being the symbol, and then, in the evenings, at the writing desk, with the candle burning down and the house quieter than it would ever be in daylight, 63 years of also being herself, on the page, to the people she trusted. The paper is thin, the ink has faded to something between brown and grey. The handwriting leans forward, always forward, as if she could not get the words down fast enough. She was, the letters tell us, exactly who the private evidence has always suggested she was, a person of enormous feeling, genuine intelligence, frequent pettiness, unexpected humour, and a longing for intimacy that the conditions of her life made almost structurally impossible to satisfy. She was, in the letters, simply human, and the letters survived. And they are enough. The Isle of Wight in January is a particular kind of cold, not the theatrical cold of the Scottish Highlands, Not the wet grey cold of London in December. It is a sea cold, quiet, persistent, the kind that comes off the Solent in the early mornings and settles into the stone of old houses and does not leave until well past noon. The light on those January mornings is thin and white, the colour of paper held up to a window, and the water below the grounds of Osborne House catches it and gives it back at an angle, so that the whole estate seems to exist inside something silver and slightly unreal. Victoria had loved this place. She and Albert had designed it together, had genuinely designed it, not simply approved drawings, but sat with the architect Thomas Cubitt and argued about proportions, about the width of terraces, about where the gardens ought to fall. Albert had wanted it to feel like a villa on the Bay of Naples, warm stone and Italianate towers, a domestic scale that Buckingham Palace never permitted. They had come here to be, in whatever way was available to them, a family rather than a dynasty, and the children had run on those terraces. And Albert had stood at that view and felt, perhaps, something like uncomplicated pleasure. He had been dead for almost 40 years. She had arrived at Osborne for the last time in December of 1900. Those close to her had been watching the slow diminishment for months, the failing eyesight, the increasing difficulty walking, the confusion that came and went. Her journal, which she had kept without interruption since she was 13 years old, had been growing shorter, brief entries, then shorter still. The handwriting she had maintained with such fierce precision across 6 decades had begun, at last, to waver. The biographer Gillian Packard and, more extensively, the historian A.N. Wilson, in his 2014 biography of Victoria, have both noted that the Queen's deterioration in those final weeks was more rapid than the court was willing to acknowledge publicly. She had largely stopped eating. She was sleeping longer. The women of her household moved quietly through the corridors of Osborne, speaking in low voices, the sound of their skirts on the floors replaced by something more careful, more deliberate, the particular hush of people who are waiting. The house smelled, in those weeks, of cut flowers, brought in daily despite the season, narcissi and forced hyacinths, their sweetness slightly too thick in the sick-room air, and underneath them, the salt from the sea, coming in through whatever small gap the cold permitted, and the warm smell of coal fires kept high in every grate. I want to stop here for a moment, because I find this detail genuinely moving, and I think it is worth sitting with. Victoria had spent her entire life being arranged, being positioned, being displayed. From the day she became queen at 18, woken at Kensington Palace in the early morning, still in her nightgown, brought into a room full of men who required something of her immediately, she had been the object of a gaze that never, entirely, looked away. Every public appearance was rehearsed, every photograph was managed, every letter she sent to a prime minister was aware that it would be read by more than one set of eyes. She had been performing, at some level, for 63 years, and now the performance was ending. And what is astonishing, what I find myself returning to whenever I think about Victoria's death, is what she chose to do in the last space where no one could arrange her anymore. She chose to show, at last, what was actually inside. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about royal deaths in 1901, because I think you'll find the specifics genuinely surprising. The death of a British monarch in the Victorian era was an elaborate and precisely choreographed event even before the death occurred. Protocols existed for every stage: who was permitted in the room, in what order family members were to be summoned, what the official communiques would say, and when they would be released. After death, the body would be laid out according to strict ceremonial tradition. Lying in state would follow. The coffin itself, its appearance, the garments the deceased was dressed in, the objects permitted to accompany the body, was a matter of court protocol as much as personal preference. Victoria had prepared for her own death with characteristic thoroughness. She had left specific written instructions, and those instructions, which the biographer Stanley Weintraub documented in detail in his book. Victoria, an intimate biography. Contained something the court did not entirely expect, a list, a private list, of objects to be placed in the coffin alongside the official robes beneath a covering cloth where they would not be visible during any public ceremony. The objects on that list were not the artifacts of a queen, they were the artifacts of a woman. A lock of Albert's hair, kept for 40 years, handled so often that the envelope which held it had grown soft at the folds. A plaster cast of Albert's hand, made in the early years of their marriage, when the thought of losing the shape of him was already, perhaps, something she allowed herself to imagine and fear. A ring that had belonged to John Brown, the Highland servant who had steadied her and infuriated her court and given her, in the long grey years of widowhood, something that functioned, whatever its precise nature, like being known. And a photograph of John Brown, placed, at her instruction, in her hand. The court, specifically her son and heir Bertie, who would become Edward VII, was reportedly uncomfortable with these instructions. Uncomfortable is probably the gentlest word available. John Brown had been a source of gossip and scandal for decades. The relationship, whatever it was, had never been officially acknowledged as anything beyond that of faithful servant and grateful sovereign. And here was Victoria, in her last dispositions, insisting that his photograph travel with her into whatever came next, held in the hand that had signed the documents of empire. Bertie could not refuse a dead woman's written wishes. The photograph went in, back with Victoria now, in those last days. The family had assembled. It was, the historian Lytton Strachey wrote in his 1921 biography, Queen Victoria. Still one of the most vivid accounts of her final hours, a gathering of the dynasties she had seeded across Europe, her children, her grandchildren, the network of royal houses into which she had sent her daughters and sons, like seeds scattered across a continent. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, her grandson, a man she had complicated feelings about, and he complicated feelings about her, came to Osborne and was there at the end. He was said to have held her in his arms as she died. She died on the 22nd of January, 1901, at 6:30 in the evening. The sea light would have been gone for hours by then. The room would have been lit by lamps, the windows dark, the sound of the Solent somewhere beyond the glass. She had been drifting in and out of consciousness. Her last intelligible words, recorded by those present, are reported to have included the name Bertie. Whether she was calling for her son, or simply surfacing briefly from somewhere very far away, is one of those questions the records cannot answer. She was 81 years old. She had been queen for 63 years. She had outlasted everyone who had truly known her. The coffin was brought out of Osborne House into January light. The official ceremonies began, the lying in state, the procession, the choreography of imperial mourning that the court had been rehearsing, in various forms, for years. The world watched. The newspapers filled. The era closed with enormous formal ceremony, as eras do. And underneath the white robes, in the darkness that no ceremony reached, lay a lock of hair, a cast of a hand, a ring, and a photograph held between two old hands that had, for 63 years, been required to hold so many other things. The private Victoria, carried, finally, quietly, into a place where no one was watching. The evidence she left us is enough. It was always enough. She simply had to wait until the very end to give it to us freely. The quiet at the end of everything. And so we find ourselves here, at the end of a long evening together, and I want to slow down now. I want to let the story breathe. No more facts to hand you. No more dates or letters or scandals or court intrigues. Just this, quietly, between us. Let me bring you back to one image. It has stayed with me throughout all of this, and I find myself returning to it the way you return to a room in a house you grew up in. Not because anything particular happened there, but because the room itself holds something. The image is this: Victoria, alone, late at night, at her writing desk. A candle lit, the pen in her hand, the journal open, Outside, the whole apparatus of empire, the ministers, the secretaries, the ladies-in-waiting, the protocol and the pageantry, and the enormous grinding machinery of what the world expected her to be. And inside, just this, a woman writing down what she actually felt. She wrote millions of words in those journals, millions, and many of them were crossed out, torn away, burned by her daughter Beatrice with a patience and a thoroughness that I find, even now, even knowing it was done with a particular kind of loyalty, genuinely heartbreaking. Because what Beatrice destroyed was not history, exactly. What she destroyed was interiority, the private record of a woman thinking out loud in the dark. And I think about that a great deal. I think about the fact that Victoria understood, perhaps more clearly than most people who have ever lived, the difference between being seen and being known. She was seen by more eyes than almost any human being of her century. Her image was printed on stamps, on coins, on the walls of buildings across 6 continents. Millions of people carried a small metal likeness of her face in their pockets every single day. And yet the woman behind that face, the woman who raged and wept and laughed too loudly and ate too fast, and loved with a ferocity that frightened the people around her, that woman was kept, very carefully, out of the picture. There is something in that particular gap between the seen and the known that feels genuinely universal to me. I don't think it belongs only to queens. I think most of us live, to some degree, in that same gap, the version of ourselves that faces outward. And then the other one, the one that sits up late, the one that writes things down and then crosses them out, the one that grieves more than anyone knows, that needs more than it is easy to admit, that loves people in ways that are inconvenient and difficult to explain. Victoria was not permitted to live in that gap openly. The world required the monument. The era required the symbol. And so she gave them those things, for 63 years, with a dedication that was, whatever else you might say about her, genuinely extraordinary. But she also gave herself, in the private hours, to the people who let her simply be a person. Albert, who understood her and steadied her, and whose absence left a wound that never fully closed. John Brown, whose bluntness she found restoring in a way she could not quite explain and did not try to. Abdul Karim, whose company in her final years was a quiet, stubborn act of being herself against the wishes of everyone around her. I find myself wondering whether the private Victoria, the one in the journals, the one at the desk with the candle, was in some ways more sovereign than the public one, more fully in possession of herself, more honestly alive to what she was and what she felt and what she needed. Perhaps. I can't know that. Nobody can. But I think there is something worth sitting with in that idea, as the evening gets quiet around you and the day gets further away. You do not need to hold on to any of the details now. Let them go. Let the dates soften. Let the names drift. Let the whole long story of a long life dissolve gently into the dark, where all stories eventually rest. Wherever you are tonight, whatever room, whatever city, whatever quiet your evening has finally arrived at, I hope it feels like enough. I hope the weight of the day is going out of your shoulders even now. I hope your breathing is slowing in the way it does when the body finally decides it is safe to stop. Think of a candle, a small warm light in a dark room, the scratch of a pen going quiet, a window, and beyond the window, the particular stillness of very late at night, when the world is not watching and does not need anything from you. Just that, just the warmth, just the dark, just the slow, unhurried act of being human in a room where no one is performing. Sleep well, friend. Good night, wherever you are.